Hi, this is Samantha and Ceci.
It's your boy, George Philip D. First.
And this is Masculinity.
Swish, 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 swish.
Yeah, what a world.
Yo, yesterday I was on the train and I'm pretty sure I saw Michael Shannon. But then I was like, why is Michael Shannon riding the Q train? And then I was like, but he's wearing sunglasses on the fucking train. And nobody wears sunglasses on the fucking train except for famous people. So like that's definitely Michael Shannon. Yes, it is.
Oh, please. Try the 3-4 train near Utica Avenue. You'll find plenty of people with sunglasses in the middle of the day, in the middle of the night.
I feel, well, okay, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have been guilty of this. I'm not going to lie. I've checked myself on said front, but, one of the things that's been happening that's been really, really fun for me, not seeing celebrities, unfortunately, but, it's been really nice to, be outside again.
What does that mean?
It means...
What is the outside world you speak of?
Right. For a while, I didn't see said world myself, so I understand what you're saying there, but just, going to the Roots picnic was really fun, even though there was, a really, really, really scary moment where I thought there might be a mass shooting going down.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, it was really scary. But besides that, it's been good. So, but without further ado, the other things that have been going on lately, which, this has been a little while. The fuss has kind of died down because our administration is busy, creating all kinds of fires to put out. But there has been quite a bit of fuss over the abortion bans in Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio, among other states, this year. And it's brought up questions about people's rights to choose and what they're allowed to do with their bodies. So you might ask yourself, this is the Masculinity Podcast. This is the sex modules. What does that have to do? What does abortion have to do with masculinity and the performance of masculinity? And if the performance of masculinity calls for domination and control of others, then it's completely unsurprising, actually, to have an outcome where people who are most severely affected by decisions on reproductive health are actually not the ones making them. It actually goes hand in hand with supremacy. So, it kind of feels like a denial of choice when it comes to sex, reproductive freedom, and ultimately people's dignity and humanity. And it's worth pointing out that the most punitive abortion law, which is Alabama's, was actually written by a woman, and then it passed the House 74-3 and included 5 votes from women before finally being signed into law by another woman, Kay Ivey, who is the governor of Alabama. So this party vote really highlights how 5 women participated in upholding patriarchal control. And really, that has a lot less to do with how men and women have distinct values and a lot more to do with the cultural commitment to maintaining control and domination over marginalized groups.
Yeah, and looking at that research, it looks like women and men, kind of using binary terms here because this is what we have access to, they're more or less equal on abortion worldwide with a few exceptions. Heidi Sick from Vote Pro-Choice pointed out on our previous episode that in this country, the general population is in favor of having access to legal abortion, and that number is 60%. And it's actually fairly similar between men and women, 60% for women and 50% for men, 57% for men, according to the Pew Research Center. State by state, things are a little different, though states like Ohio and Georgia, which have also passed anti-abortion laws, are a bit more divided on the issue than their legislative bodies would portray. Alabama's population is largely in favor of abortion being illegal, with 57% of women against legal abortion and 53% of men being against legal abortion.
Yeah, so there are a few things to look at today. We're going to look at 3 things, right? So the first one
Tell me.
Yeah, no, this is wild. So the first one is really the denial of choice, which is really just a function of domination and control. It's a natural consequence of the current patriarchal context, irrespective of gender, and actually going against that would be a disruption to America's fabric. Okay, so the second thing to take a look at here is that as a dominant group, it is important for men to take some responsibility in changing this narrative. And really, let's take a look at how have men actually come to understand their role in reproduction and then in reproductive justice. is there actually space being made for them, and or are they held responsible for any of it at any point in their lives? And finally, the third point we're trying to make, or at least the third thing that we're trying to look at, is just that there's the myth that men aren't really involved in the choice to have an abortion.
Bullshit.
I know. I mean, given that 9 out of 10 unwanted pregnancies occur in relationships and that the male partner is usually...
I think a relationship means more than one. I don't know.
That's the thing. It takes 2 to tango.
That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah. I thank you for that. I was
You're
like,
welcome.
that's corny.
I set you up. That was like an alley-oop of sorts.
I appreciate that.
Keeping it on brand.
Yeah, thanks. So the male partner is actually usually consulted when making that decision, which further contributes to a certain type of narrative, right, about how men aren't involved. All right, so luckily for us, we have some bona fide experts in the house today.
Woo!
Yeah. So extending a huge and warm welcome to Wazina Zondon.
Shout out to the homie.
Zondon, Zondon,
Zondon.
Yeah,
I like
that's actually
Zondon.
Shout
the
out to the
pronunciation.
homie.
Nice.
All right.
Wazina Zondon. That's like so
I can
pretty.
never pronounce that
Damn.
ever.
It's okay.
Wow.
And this is all about choice today. So
Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, so Wazina, welcome.
Synergy.
So Wazina is a sexuality and social justice-minded educator. Yes, based in Brooklyn. So shout out to Brooklyn. Thank you for being here. You've worked in a variety of dynamic settings and communities on issues related to holistic sexuality and its intersections at the crossroads of race, class, gender, and religion.
Damn.
I know. And as an organizer and educator, you've trained in settings from multinational corporations to elementary schools around the nation. So thank you for doing the good work that you do.
I should just go quit and let
I'm lucky to do it.
Wazina just step in
Thank you,
here and
Lauren.
be co-host now from now on.
Actually, that would
Hey! Chill.
JK.
No, you're necessary.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you're necessary.
Yeah.
All right. So welcome, Wazina.
Thank you.
And I'm so pleased to have a really, really, really great friend of mine.
hey,
who
pal.
also happens to be a rock star, Mr. Andrew
Rockstar's
Stern.
in the room.
Yeah. Andy used to be the COO at the National Institute of Reproductive Justice, or Reproductive Rights, here in New York for years. And you were also the political director at GMHC, that's Gay Men's
Health Crisis.
Yeah.
So thank you for being here, Andrew. Your knowledge and wisdom are very exciting. So it's going to be a good conversation.
Happy to be here. Wish it were a better time in this country to have this discussion.
Well, I mean, it's great to have both of you here because in a way we'll get to understand what, people's understanding of sex and reproductive rights are before they're at the point in their lives where they are having sex, and with you, Wazina, and then in the aftermath of intercourse and sex and through the lens of reproductive rights and justice with you, Andy. So, Wazina, can you start by telling us about your work as a, sex educator?
Yeah. I am just so lucky to be a sex educator, trainer, all the things. I'm trying to think what are the other names for sex educator. But I get to teach sex ed through a holistic lens, which means it's not just about the act of sex, it's not just about junk and body parts, but sexuality is I think of it as a pizza pie. It's like these 8 slices that interact, and for some of us, the 8 slices, we can only eat 2 out of the 8, so we're only present to 2. Maybe we're only present to our body and health slice, our which includes anatomy, STIs, infections, hygiene, and then there's also body image and self-esteem, there's relationships, love and affection, there's sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, sexual violence, from catcalls to not flirtation, that's sexual activity, flirtation to me, to sexual assault and rape and violence, we think about that spectrum, pleasure, and am I missing the 8th one? But it's all these entities, so it's holistic, and I get to teach it from in drips and drops from middle school through high school. Right now I'm in a high school, so it's holistic that way, just when it's appropriate and the time that they can discuss it and it's ready to be discussed. So it's holistic, it's sex positive, it's centers pleasure but also centers choice and when you're ready, and it's also very LGBT affirming. So I talk about gender identity, transness, cisness and sexual identity, not just when it's like sexual orientation piece of it, but it's like woven throughout from middle school through high school and elementary if I have the option. So I get to teach this like all day long. Yeah.
I just want to say, once I was standing at a whiteboard and Wazina was teaching me about the 4 Ps, and she was teaching me all about sex ed. And as a 35-year-old man who grew up in the Texas Panhandle with a sex ed class that was like 1 class period and like 365-day school year, it was a great fucking sexual education experience. It was fantastic.
Our Ps were
4 Ps.
4 Ps: pleasure, pee, period, poop. Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, in terms of thinking about anatomy, some parts are used for pee, poop, pleasure, and periods.
Okay.
And look, I think it's really worth and important to say that if the anti-choice movement really cared about lowering abortion rates, this is exactly how they would do it. There would be age-appropriate, comprehensive sex education in every single school all across the country. This kind of work is exactly what we need to lower abortion rates, and they have no interest in doing that.
No.
Absolutely none.
I want to go a little bit off script, but within this specific conversation and this idea, have either of you like gone into more conservative spaces, whether it's in the education or in just conservative spaces, and had these conversations? And when I say have these conversations, I mean try to set a more conversational or productive, as we were speaking to earlier, like environment?
Yeah, I mean, I've taught in New York City, but when I started in the Hudson Valley, so I was in Orange and Dutchess County primarily. And
Orange is interesting.
And Orange County
Can be
from,
very...
it starts exit 15 on the thruway through exit 17-ish. It is a swath of land that I had worked in very conservative school districts. Some schools, interestingly enough, where I was initially invited to only speak to the teen moms because there was so much, the adolescent pregnancy was so high in these one areas that they had classes for just the teen moms. Their kids would be dropped off at a daycare that the school sponsored, and then I would only do contraception with these
You would only do contraception, but with the teen moms?
The teen moms. I'm
like,
pointing
did they
at
think
Samantha.
that they got pregnant alone, or?
The teen mom, yeah, exactly. And also, why, like, they've gotten pregnant. Like, can we, like, the school was not even thinking about, we should,
proactive.
our students got pregnant, not by themselves, but it was only for the young women. And they weren't taking a lesson from this to talk to the other students. And so it took a minute to just actually, I think for some of the schools who are also nervous about parents and family concern, to almost test drive and figure out, like, is this person are these lessons going to be problematic? Are they going to be challenging in any way to, are they going to like raise any red flags? And it took a while, but it ended up being something that, in these more conservative settings, that I was able to then be able to create collaborations. First, it was just sessions through the PTA for families, for anybody who had a hand in raising a young person. It wasn't just the parents, but, we were raised intergenerationally. And that was a really, it was a win for me in terms of a conservative area that I was, if the school is not equipped or the parents are not interested in having the schools talk about it, let's give the families some new information or fill in the gaps in knowledge, and then they can go ahead and initiate conversations. Also, it's a way for families to preview the content and know that, there's nothing that I really am against here in this moment and setting. So that was like a win for me and a way to,
And just for a bit of a reality check, I know we're talking about working with conservatives, and I can speak to that mostly having spent the last 30 years talking to elected officials about these issues. But just for reality's sake, New York City, which I think most of us consider to be the bastion of left-wing progressive politics, does not have currently a comprehensive across-the-board sex education program in its schools. It's something that my organization has been fighting for a very, very long time, still have not been able to accomplish. Adults are terrified of talking about sex, particularly when it comes to their teenagers. And finding a place of where that comfort lies is complicated. It happens over a very long period of time. It can happen. I've seen it happen. I've seen changes in the way sex education is taught. I'll be frank, I used to teach it 10 years ago, and about 5 years ago had to stop doing it because it had overtaken me in terms of my own knowledge, particularly around LGBTQ issues. I couldn't teach it anymore because there was so much new material. So I just think it's important that we're really not just talking about conservative areas. We are talking about Midtown Manhattan and Brooklyn and very large bastions of progressive politics. People are terrified of talking about sex and their teens learning about it because of very false assumptions that if provided with information, they'll
go
use
and
that.
make babies.
You got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when sex ed, now more and more we talk a lot more about consent. There's a lot more about power and privilege, and depending on where you're teaching it, the families that were into you teaching this concept is, and especially when I'm thinking about the theme of, or like just this masculinity podcast, we talk about consent a lot more in spaces where there's multiple genders of students, and because of maybe the way privilege is checked, and I'm thinking about these progressive, I'm using my fingers here, like quotations, like so-called progressive spaces where there's a lot of like cis white boys. Their families also are now flip-flopping on messages around how they're confronted about power, the hashtag #MeToo movement. And so while they might have gotten really messages that were in line with what I like, my politics, or generally the politics of progressive and holistic, inclusive sex ed, there's also this backlash, the way that sexism is showing up in these boys' homes, where they are nervous, and I think parents are also maybe injecting this like discomfort in them, and like around having them make sure that maybe because they're just like their masculinity is so confronted, right? Essentially, that they're like on guard, and when I work in spaces where because I work in an all-girls school, but when I work in co-ed and multi-gendered spaces, there's a lot more pushback because I think is that the word, the heckles are up, or like they're like ready to like defend themselves, and so sometimes I feel like people are a little bit closed off to hearing conversations.
Well,
right
and
now.
I think that speaks to this entire conversation today, right? Masculinity and the fear of being questioned is terrifying to most men who are very, very used to their privilege and very comfortable with it. So it actually makes perfect sense that young men growing up in homes, this is what they're taught under the patriarchy that we've talked about before.
In sexuality and sex ed classes, we've been challenging the bedrock of heteronormativity for a long time, and I feel like I'm very much better at having done that, but that is not a one-shot deal. That is, for sex ed to be successful, it has to be long-term. It has to be, again, those little drips and drops where it's appropriate when they can understand it. It's also meant to go alongside not just the values they come in with, but it's the person, like the values they begin to develop with alongside the experiences they have. And so I think when I would have a conversation about heteronormativity, like just homophobia, and talking about heterosexuality and how compulsory it was and taught and encouraged, it wouldn't work in sixth grade necessarily. But really, it's important to start in sixth grade, fifth grade, fourth grade, and just kind of like keep having conversations where you find that opening. And I think similarly in this case, when we're talking about essentially white supremacy, it has to be done in these ways where you find these entry points for folks to be able to like these young people to like look at themselves, but also more than look at themselves, because I think that's that's when you're 17, 18, you get to like name what's happening in society, media, use those tools to like they have to come to their own understanding, or what's the word, like realization, like aha moment about it.
Like a discovery.
Yeah. Like they discovered whiteness for the first time. Like, yes, you did.
And frankly, that's what's so extraordinary about this work. We also have a peer education program where we teach youth about these issues and then send them back to their own schools to do peer-to-peer education. It's not just about sex and what you choose to do or not do. I have seen lives changed. I have seen growth in individuals in terms of how they treat women, in terms of how they treat their peers. I have seen people go on to a higher education who never thought it was a possibility for them to do so. I've seen this work change lives because it opens them up to entirely new worlds of thought that they've never had before.
I think that makes sense because it's really I mean, one of the main things that we talk about on the show is like really kind of getting connected to our sense of humanity and recognizing that humanity in another human being, right? And I think that when we talk about the performance of masculinity, the main thing is that really the system of patriarchy has us all be dehumanized, right? I mean, we experience it at different levels because there's like a certain level of domination that people are afforded versus others. But at the end of the day, even that level of like being a dominator is dehumanizing in a certain way. And so I appreciate, your comment about the different ways that it opens up ways of acting that aren't so siloed, right? It's not really just about like, sex itself, but really just about like the interaction with human beings just on a more global level.
I mean, a conversation about consent is about way more than simply sexual consent, right?
Yeah.
It becomes a much larger conversation about culture, about how we treat one another.
It's also about desire. I feel like we talk about pleasure just like maybe it's orgasm. It's like that topical, shallow way. But pleasure is so much more about, right, like what brings you joy. And if I know what brings me joy, I may not actually force you into oral sex or the thing that I didn't actually want to do. But that's just a way to get this shallow, good feeling when I actually have lots of other places and ways that I might want to access my like excitement, my joy, my happiness, and both all genders, and especially the broad range of teens. Most of us don't, and I'm thinking about most of us as younger Wazina. I never knew what I wanted to do. I didn't know what I could have. I didn't know what made me happy, because teens are so regulated. They don't know what makes them happy. They don't know what they really, really want because they don't know what they're allowed to like access. And that to me, I think about
a lot of adults don't.
No.
Yeah. Just segueing, Andy, into your role working at the National Institute for Reproductive Rights, right? So, it can be kind of like considered the other end of the timeline in terms of like understanding sex prior and then understanding kind of like the fallout or like the consequences or the outcomes of the ways of what we do. And so in that, just dealing with reproductive rights, dealing with reproductive justice after sex, I imagine that you saw the impact of our legal system in a very concrete way. And I want to ask you about your work, but I do think that it's worth it for us to have some definitions reiterated in terms of what exactly do we mean when we say reproductive rights versus reproductive justice and things like that. If you wouldn't mind shedding some light.
No, sure. And a few different things come to mind. I'm a very big believer, I suspect we all are, that words really matter a great deal, particularly in this battle. And through no fault of your own, when I hear words like fallout and consequences of, there's an immediate negative connotation to a woman getting pregnant and making a choice, right? Which is a different thing than dealing with the fallout, right? For many, many years, and I think this is true for most movements. It was also true during my time doing HIV/AIDS work. Movements were one-issue movements. And I think that in and of itself was about power and privilege and who had it. In the early 1970s, when the right to an abortion became law, women who had fought for it for a very long time were in positions of greater power than they had been in the past and were much less likely to include other issues into that singular issue. I would actually argue from my experience that AIDS might have been the first time that we saw a myriad of issues converging where we started to realize that someone living with AIDS, that might have been number 5 on the list of things that they were dealing with. In addition to housing, to food, to having a living wage, to basic health care, and then dealing with them having HIV or AIDS, which was a very different model.
That's like the pizza thing you were talking about. Yeah.
Very different model than we had ever seen before, because generally speaking, I think this is an across-the-board notion, whoever has the power kind of likes to keep the power, which speaks to, again, patriarchy and how that works. The reproductive rights movement was very much, and still is, a movement that is fundamentally about abortion rights. Now, it's really interesting because you talk about the work that NIRH does in terms of the aftermath. It's important to note. Very supportive of comprehensive sex education in the schools,
Right.
birth control access, emergency.
Good job, NIRH.
Emergency
Yeah.
contraception. But, for many years when I talked about where I worked, I talked about working at a reproductive rights organization. And after about 10 years and being called out quite often, I changed my tune and stood tall and said, I work at an abortion rights organization. And that was an important distinction. So even though we do other work, we are fundamentally an abortion rights organization.
As you should.
Right. The reproductive justice movement, I am not the person who should be the spokesperson for the reproductive justice movement as a white man, because it is a largely women of color driven movement.
Appreciate the acknowledgement of that.
Is a movement that acknowledges that abortion care is absolutely critical to a woman having the life that she chooses and having the choices that she needs to make. But there's also a recognition that it is one of a myriad of issues that particularly women in this country, particularly low-income women in this country, deal with every day, and that to focus on one singular issue when there are 10 other issues that are all intersected with one another is to do a disservice to the woman and to the greater movement. So the reproductive justice movement has pushed the reproductive rights movement to not just focus and be a singular issue movement, but to be much more thoughtful about how many different issues impact women and to hopefully create coalitions and allies to work to change those issues for the better.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, because I'm really hearing how this is which we'll get to a little bit later, but this is an economic justice issue, which.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tremendously.
Yeah, we're getting there.
The impact of minimum wage on a woman's right to an abortion is tremendous.
Which, when you take a look at that as take a look at the big picture of that, and then you kind of see, you contextualize that in our huge machine and system that is this white supremacist, patriarchal machine, right? And you take a look at what's been happening with, in almost all ways, if you're looking at the performance of masculinity through the lens of the legislative system and seeing men legislating all these laws surrounding abortion, reproductive health, more generally, it's interesting because there does seem to be a disconnect between the way that people actually feel and the ways that the laws are being passed, which I think is, in a weird way, I'm thinking about it now, a weird parallel to kind of the education dynamic, right? Where there's kids are feeling this way, but then their parents are actually, that's not what we're going to do.
And overwhelmingly, over 90% of parents are interested in sexual education in some form or format for their young person, but it just doesn't trickle into the policies and laws and mandates that get passed.
I would also say you need to take one step further back. I know that you're essentially talking about statistics of men and women and who's pro-choice versus what we see in the legislature. But I think it's even more important to recognize that the demographics of this country so dramatically differ from the demographics in our legislatures that the representation, right, is so skewed that one of the things that I do believe can and will happen over time, and we have seen it a little bit, not nearly enough. I mean, I do remember when no women were serving in legislatures. I actually remember that period of time, and no people of color, and that has changed in certain places. But until we get anywhere near the demographics in our state houses and in D.C. matching the demographics of the individuals living here, we're never going to get the kind of representation you're talking about where people who are pro-choice are being represented in the legislature.
Yeah.
Okay, so and approach this productively, because I don't know how to approach this productively, and I came from this previous rhetoric in my early years growing up in Texas Panhandle, but a lot of the rhetoric isn't, it can be couched as one way or another, like anti-choice and not pro-life, but they couch it as pro-life and not anti-choice, right? And the argument there is, granted, it may not have deep roots, but the argument there is it's about killing the child. So how do we have, and their argument is that at certain, and granted this argument has a spectrum, but at a certain time that is a child, and then it's the termination of that life that is coming into question, not the woman's choice. So how do you have a positive conversation within that rhetoric?
And it's also become more complicated in recent decades as science has improved, and that has ramifications for a fetus being able to survive. It's a very, very complicated issue.
So what does that look like, whether it comes on the education front or within the legislative front, or when it comes just to individuals who are adamantly pro-life?
So I would Matthew, you want to go?
No.
We all have
here.
something
I have
to say.
a hell of opinions, but I'm not the expert here, so I'll let you guys go fight it.
So for me, I would then contextualize it in I sometimes will be like, well, at 9 weeks old, the thing is no bigger than my booger. I don't want to say that, but it is actually. But it's true. A booger does not a life make.
Facts. Not opinion. Facts. Yeah.
But so for me, then if the abortion piece is going to be too heavy to have, there's so many values, and as somebody who's a person of faith, there's no way for someone to actually rationalize with me certain things, because I work from an irrational plane. Because for me, religion and God lives on an irrational plane. So I'm like, okay, I'd like to take it from the same place that I would want somebody with me to be like, if they challenge my belief in Allah, then I'd be like, I would want them to be tread lightly with me too, and kindly and lovingly. So I would maybe say something along the lines of the pro-choice movement really does hold this as a truth. I would almost get you, if you were saying that this thing's a life and whatever, then you and I actually have nothing. We have a lot more in common than you think, because the pro-choice movement actually encourages us to keep that from even happening, right? The pro-choice movement, if funded and supported and encouraged the way it ought to, this would not even be an issue you'd have to deal with, where you'd have to consider compromising your life or the life of this fetus, because you'd have access to services and information about whether or not to keep you from getting pregnant in the first place, or someone from getting pregnant. So I think that's what I would kind of get at.
Right.
Now, and I think I love this conversation, because to be perfectly frank, this kind of conversation never happens. It never happens within pro-choice organizations themselves, who have their own dogma about what they're willing to discuss. And the slippery slope notion that if you're open to having conversations, that there is very little, much less the two different movements ever trying to find a place to meet in the middle. I think the first thing one really needs to do is to distinguish those people who are truly pro-life, in that they believe that a fetus is a life, and that removing that fetus is killing a child. And there are most certainly people, for religious reasons, for scientific, who have those beliefs. From those people, and I would argue it's actually a much, much larger segment of people who are much less interested in the fetus, because if they were, there would be comprehensive sex education. There would be a plan for dealing with the babies once they were born that simply doesn't exist. I would argue the larger segment of the anti-choice community, because I do think there's a pro-choice community and an anti-choice community, is about patriarchy and is about control and largely, certainly not exclusively, but largely controlled by white men of privilege who want to control what a woman can and can't do with her body so that they remain in control of the country.
It's true. I think there's
I think you need to separate those two groups of people out.
Yeah, and it's a lot about sex shaming. It's about like peddling not just patriarchy, and women are great at doing this as well. Like, you know, that are the ones that are promoting, protecting, and maintaining patriarchy and sex shaming and the negativity. Like, it is about who's there, and also projecting on their own personal values, whatever if it's contextualized in a religious reason around no sex before marriage. Like, there's a lot more rooted to that.
And I would say we desperately, in terms of this movement and this conversation, need to be able to have more nuanced conversations, both with ourselves. And I mean, I can tell you, I have met individuals who I genuinely believe are 100% pro-choice and believe in a woman's right to an abortion, but get really stuck around parental notification, right? A person who simply does not believe that a 15-year-old should have a surgical procedure without a parent knowing about it. And these are people who truly consider themselves to be genuinely pro-choice. Now, I have 20 different reactions to that in terms of why it's much more complicated, but we never allow ourselves to have those conversations because, again, it becomes this slippery slope of, if you're willing to even be open to discuss it, what does that mean for other issues around abortion rights?
I mean, this is always going to be the challenge of moral ambiguity and an ambiguity in a space that is strictly binary, right? So, and we've seen some growth. At least we've kind of documented it, even this conversation in the last few years, whatever that means, that society is pushing the next generation is pushing to being a little bit more comfortable with moral ambiguity. But still, going back to like playing a little bit of devil's advocate, I think what an interesting word used towards the beginning of what you were saying was, was like holistic, right? Now, granted, holistic in our circles is a great word, or is an understood word, but I think in conservative circles, or in like right wing or southern or wherever you want to call it, Orange County, New York, it can be almost like antagonistic, being like, oh, those liberal hippies, like holistic, roll your eyes, right? But I think that's kind of like a key to what you're talking about when it comes to education and confronting reproductive health and reproductive rights. I don't know which one I said it correctly there. Beforehand, and understanding that as a whole as being a solve to the issue of child pregnancy at an early age, or unknown pregnancy, or education being accessible. So can you talk, both of you, further, I guess, making this conversation even more accessible? Like, what does holistic thinking when it comes to reproductive education, reproductive rights look like for the general public?
Thinking on this, like, more than just
if you're going to communicate like this idea of holistic sexual health or sexual education to a middle school in Lincoln, Nebraska, how do you breach that or make that conversation more accessible? For
me, I also I was looking at the questions about abstinence, and like, right, for me, I love to lead with abstinence, and I find no disruption or threat or undermining in my sexuality education and training to lead with and like really like emphasize abstinence, because I think it's a option that never gets enough play, because I think for many of us, we think or have been taught that if you begin to be sexually active, then you can never stop. And for me, the holistic mentality, or like keep having this wide range of options, is to also include abstinence as this. It's not just, clearly it's not the act of just saying no, but it's how we negotiate. It's how, but you just have to use it right. I can spend a lot more I don't need to spend that much time talking to you about how to put a condom on, or how to take the pill or the ring or the patch, all your, contraception options. I need to spend a lot more time unpacking what abstinence looks like and sounds like. It's negotiation. It's asking your own self around. You're like, what are my personal values? What do I desire? What are my goals? There's so much more time that needs to be spent on this piece of it. So for me, when I think about holisticness, there's like being more holistic. I think it's also a way to let people know that I nowhere near in any way, shape, or form, even in 5 years with one student, I do not exhaust. I have not exhausted the options with them. Like we haven't actually even we haven't even touched the tip of it. No pun intended. That's what she said. In any way, shape, or form. So I mean, holistic means there's just so much more to explore. That's for right now.
And what's so interesting in terms of how we differ in terms of the work that we do, because I love that you talk about abstinence and that it's a very holistic approach. The work that I do is very political, which means it is all about strategy.
Sure.
You raise the issue of abstinence, and automatically what comes to mind is abstinence only, and how much funding, we're talking millions and millions of dollars, goes to abstinence-only programs that we know don't work. Now, those are two very different things that we're talking about, right? You are talking about abstinence as a holistic part of a larger discussion, but the
As a
country,
practice.
right. But there are a lot of teens out there that are being taught abstinence only is the only choice and the only way to go, and parents who are considering that to be sex education.
Right. And it's funny because I think of abstinence also as part of the same themes of like harm reduction. So like abstinence is something you use if you don't want to have sex, but if you wanted to have sex and you didn't have a condom, or like your person, like for all the different reasons why, like this is your plan B. Sometimes it's not abstinence, not your plan A. We're gonna do something. Harm reduction rate means that you don't disqualify the desire, the choice, or to engage in any particular activity, from whether it's sexual activity to drinking, whatever, all the different forms of drug use, as long as you have a safety plan for yourself.
Yep.
And I think of it as part of my harm reduction strategies.
And again, it's so fascinating to me, again, as someone who comes from the AIDS movement and is now in the reproductive rights movement, because harm reduction, I think, really began with drug injections, drug users, and reducing the harm by needle exchange programs, which were very controversial. And the only reason I raise it is because the two movements, and what I think we've learned from both of those movements, are so linked in so many ways, because they're both reproductive rights and health issues. They're both about a majority trying to control a minority, although women are not a minority. They're simply treated as though they were a minority. So the things I know I have learned from one movement has certainly carried over into the work that I've done the last 18 years in this movement.
That's like a good segue. I have so many points that I want to make, but for the sake of time, I want to kind of segue into like men's roles, right? In in reproductive rights and in reproductive justice, because like, you know, there are a number of things that we pointed to here when it comes to like the ways to lead, and like, you know, with sex education and with various things, and like when we talk about like the space that like men and boys, again using a binary term, but like men and boys actually have in that, like how are they guided, or how are they welcomed, or how are they, because it's like, it seems to me like what really comes to my mind when I think about this is there's like a very distinct parallel of like fatherhood. We've been talking about fatherhood a lot, right? So like the notion of a father being somebody who provides but doesn't rear. And so here you have kind of like this notion of like men making decisions, controlling women's bodies, kind of just like this kind of like big brotherish type of force. But then when it comes to the support, when it comes to like the everyday piece of it, right? It's like, you know, like when it comes to actual, for example, sex education, like abstinence, like, or like just even teaching about sex education, it's like, no, but this is on you as a woman to make sure that you do X, Y, Z, because men don't have access to being able to control any of that. They're just going to have sex, and like, you just have to figure out like how you're going to like manage yourself in that way. And I feel like the two are very parallel, like whether it's in sex ed or whether it's in reproductive rights. And I'm just like looking for like, what does it look like for men to be part of the movement and be supportive of the movement and supportive of the people whose bodies are at stake. And I wonder if you guys can talk about that.
And we have 4 more hours to discuss this, right? I mean, first, I think it is important to note that men are involved in this movement.
Yes.
I know because I am one of them and have been for 18 years, although admittedly was the only male in a staff of 25 people, which I think does give perspective, but also board members who were. I can tell you every pro-choice rally I've ever been to, there are more than a few men.
Good.
The women's marches, men turned out in dramatic numbers. Just this year in New York, the Reproductive Health Act, which we had been lobbying for almost a decade, finally passed in New York, and it took a lot of male votes to make that happen and a male governor to sign it. So, we first need to at least recognize that there are pro-choice men who are vocal on the issue.
Which I think is an important thing to debunk, right? Because I think I was speaking kind of as a ominous perception, but it's like that is the perception, is that dudes are just not involved. It's just not their thing unless they're just like striking down the hammer and being like, no.
It's ominous, but there's also a lot of truth to it. I mean, the reality is what I've just been talking about is a minority of men as opposed to the overall, men who are running this place and what to do with them. Look, I think the first conversation we need to have is what role we want men to play in this movement in the first place.
Yeah.
Which I think is really key. I can say that as a gay man living through the AIDS epidemic, I would not have taken a back seat to straight men and women being at the forefront of that battle, because it was about empowering my voice and supporting that voice. And I truly welcomed allies. We desperately needed them. But it's who's doing the leading and who's doing the following. Men typically, historically speaking, are not great at being followers. I think that there is a lot of work that can be done around that. It's really interesting to me that I worked at a reproductive rights organization for 18 years and always considered myself to be an abortion rights ally rather than an abortion rights advocate, because I always approached the issue from the perspective that as a man who will never have to make this decision in my life, it is none of my business, and I have absolutely no right to tell a woman what she should or shouldn't do. And that actually made it really easy for me to be an absolute ally, because it's your choice, and I support it 100%. And being an ally seems like the natural place for men to fall in this issue.
I would agree.
How to get more of them to do it, I think, is a really challenging issue. We're living in really scary times. People are terrified of, again, a changing demographic, which means a loss of a power structure that people have become very, very used to. So people are very protective of control and power, possibly more now than in many recent decades. But I think there are ways of changing that. I've certainly seen men among the movement grow in reaction, frankly, to the current presidential administration, that there is so much anger and frustration that everybody is looking for ways to push back. And there's no question that the abortion rights movement is a core way of pushing back, and men are doing it alongside women.
And I would add, too, that, like, the current climate has really led to, it's led to, like, a lot of, like, racism and bigotry and all of that coming up. And it's also led to, like, a certain way that there's, like, mirror that's been kind of put up for people who exhibit that type of behavior to really take a look at the shit that they do and be like, listen, I didn't really know it was like that, but I get how bad it can get, given that this person, after everything that he's done, everything that he said, is now actually sitting on like as the most powerful person in the United States. So, but one of the things that I want to say to your point is that it does seem to be a matter of education.
Right. I
And
think
so-
more
it's
men.
all education.
And the education doesn't have to be a formal like classroom thing either, right? Like that's what it's men educating other men, and right doesn't it's all the different definitions of men and masculinity, and right toxic masculinity shows up in cis women and trans men, like all of us
Oh, yeah.
across the board, right? But it's men might like I think there are more men who are pro-choice, but whatever the catchphrase is at that, then they know that they are. I think the conversation might also be something similar to what you said, that like, I will never be in the position of being pregnant. A guy might say this, and so he may step back from the conversation, but he might have there's very important conversations to be had, and men among men about what's at stake if I do ask this person to have an abortion. Isn't like my seed is gone? Like really confronting conversations that a lot of times men are nervous to say, and they have some proximity or deep affinity to this concept of maybe pregnancy that they didn't think they had access to, because the truth is, if you don't have a uterus, then you shouldn't be saying anything, but you do have some stake in it.
And understand, I was speaking as a gay man, not
Yeah.
when I'm talking about never having to make
Yes.
that decision.
No,
but you're
100%.
absolutely
I get
right.
that.
Sure.
So there's that piece. I'm thinking about like men and this other ways for them to be involved. And even if, I just think about men, if we still live in a society where like funds, wages benefit men in particular in ways that do not benefit me as a cis woman, if you don't want to show up to the rally or whatever the case may be, you don't have other folks to talk to about this, or this is not a conversation in your community, then we like give the small monthly funding. You fund, like it's a $25 a month situation, whatever the case is.
Yep.
You give to the abortion fund. You help. You may not have to fund a woman in your life, but there's a woman out there who could really use that change or that money to help her in her abortion. So there's I think about also like the very concrete ways of supporting it. Give
And
some
look,
money.
Awesome.
Ultimately, it's the work you're doing.
Thanks.
I mean,
Thank you.
but it really happens to be true. If we want things to change, this is not going to happen overnight. We know it's not. We know it's going to take generational change, but that's only going to happen through those people who are working with younger generations right now, because they're not going to, these young men are going to be men in greater places of power.
Right.
And the only way that we're going to get more activity from men is by educating them from an earlier age.
I appreciate you giving me all the credit. I teach in an all-girls school.
Oh, stop. Wow. So, what do you think, Roy?
It's all education. It's all education.
Yeah, but what do you think men should do? I really want to know your opinion on this, because I have been thinking about this for a while, and I have my thoughts on what I think that men should be doing, but I'm also a huge proponent of letting people speak for themselves, because that's how we got in this fucking mess to begin with. So I just want to, not to say that you speak for all men, but I just want to hear what you're.
The easiest, it's not easy. The hardest thing to do is to be able to step back and identify your privilege, and but that is the biggest step towards then seeing yourself in the mirror and then seeing the greater world and yourself within that reflection, right? So I don't know how that's done, and I think it just boils back down to access to information and education, and that can start on in an elementary level, in a formal setting like a school. But one of the most frustrating thing about specifically Americans that bothers me is that we've adopted this this rhetoric that says education stops at 18. Education stops at 22, maybe 24 if you're one of those liberals that goes to gets your postdoc or something, right? Education never stops. We're always, as the animal that is Homo sapiens sapiens, we're constantly learning, and we're intaking information at a great rate, and it's informing the individual that we become and continually change and are adapting to be in a state of metamorphosis constantly, right?
Yeah.
So we just need to be able to somehow, and it's a cyclical thing, because to understand that, you have to have access to information, education to get you on that wavelength.
And look, we embarked on a race equity and diversity path 4 or 5 years ago at my organization. Some of the hardest work I've ever done, because it means me, Mr. Left-Wing Progressive, has to acknowledge my own privilege, and I didn't want to do that. And it took a lot of work. Our board, our staff, all engaged in that process, all much older than 18. But you're absolutely right. It changed the organization. It continues to change the organization. And that kind of work continues to change how how you interact with other people, your take on positions with other people, and you realize just how much more complex the world is than you thought it was. That being a good person who votes the right way and has the stamp of progressive on their lapel does not necessarily mean that they are not people of privilege and that they don't have to look every single day at that privilege and what the impact of that privilege is. And that's how the world changes little by people doing that kind of work. Sadly, there is a group of people that I think we're just going to have to wait out. Is my nice way of saying it. Samantha knows what I'm thinking right now, and I'm not going to say it. But there is a group of people for whom I think it's just too late to do much convincing, and that's okay because there's so much other work that needs to be done and can be done while that's happening.
Okay. Well, I think that's probably a good note to fade out on. I just want to thank you both for all of your knowledge and your contribution. I do feel like I have to make this one point about pro-life. I think that if an individual wants to call themselves pro-life, they need to be pro-all life, not just pro-unborn life. And I think that the fundamental issue that I have with this kind of like supremacist, what I find to be a supremacist pro-life stance is that there's no accountability toward the lives that are actually when they're actually here and being able to be nurtured. And so I know that that's not necessarily like a thing that I can say to somebody and have them be like, oh my God, you're so right. I've been being a hypocrite. But that's really my firm stance. Because when we take a look at even like the people who are, even like when we talk about the performance of masculinity, we talk about dominance and like, you know, physicality and all of the things that are included as part of the performance of masculinity, not giving this space for people's freedom and really and true selves and authenticity. That in itself is a denial of being pro-life. That's like a pro machine. That's a pro performance that has nothing to do with like allowing a human being to just be. And so I think like when we think about pro-life, it's just like you gotta be real about that shit. You know what I mean? You can't just be like pro-life halfway because you want, you know, your dude to be in the behind the desk. You know what I mean? And
might I suggest that in the near future you dedicate an entire conversation around messaging, because it really gets to the heart of what you're talking about and who decides on what the messages are. Let's be frank, the far-right movement is far better at it than the left is.
Oh, that's what Heidi was saying.
And having a conversation about why that is and how to change that is all a part of this it's almost part two of this conversation. And it's tremendous because if you want to change the hearts and minds of people, you got to use messages that they're going to get.
Yeah.
And pro-life is a message.
Yep. Marketing. Let's talk about where we can find you guys on the social medias.
On the Tumblrs.
I have made sure, and I did this weekend, that I have, where I can, all the Wazinas at whatever.
Ooh.
So I realized I had gotten wazina@gmail.com years ago, but I used a bunch of other Wazina versions. So internet, email, wazina@gmail.com, but Wazina on Instagram, @Wazina Zondon on Twitter. Something on Facebook.
That's dope.
And then I also I am interchangeable or collapse myself with Coming Out Muslim, which is a storytelling performance I have with my counterpart Tana. So Coming Out Muslim, same thing, and all the internets.
Beautiful.
Thanks.
And as Samantha knows, I turned 56 on Sunday, which means most people, if they want to get in touch with me, need a rock and a chisel. But otherwise, they can find me on Facebook under Andrew Stern or on Instagram under Andrew Stern NYC. And email is also andrewsternnyc@gmail.
Awesome. So I'm going to actually be posting your stuff, both of your stuff, but especially yours, because there are a lot of Andrew Sterns out there. I was trying to find you online. I was like, damn.
There are a lot of us, and I have like pictures with 3 of us all together at the same time. Absolutely true.
Well, thank you. I will be posting Andy's/Andrew's and Wazina's information on our social medias, which, of course, is Masculinity Pod on Twitter and Instagram, Masculinity with a K, always, and Masculinity Podcast on Facebook. We just want to thank you guys for listening to this conversation. We're really excited for season 3 and for the things to come. So make sure to tune in. Please, hit up like a little iTunes review. You know what I mean? Drop some stars, preferably 5.
5 star.
At least 4, preferably 5.
No, we got all 5s right now. Let's just keep it all 5s.
Okay, yeah, let's keep
if
all
you're
5s,
on the
guys.
line there, just go over
Let's keep
the
it all
line.
5s. Thanks. And then you can hit us up. Send us an email. Send us some questions if you have anything that you want us to tackle on the show. Masculinity Podcast at whoistheo.com, always with a K. And I just want to thank you guys for listening. My name is Samantha Zessi.
More George Phillips, the first.
And this has been Masculinity. Thank you so much for listening. Ciao.